So continuing to, excuse me, gather some more weeds on the Isle, which might have in the past been called the Isle of Wisdom, but now perhaps we might call it the Isle of Life in the Nietzschean sense, or existence in the Heideggerian sense. We're in the midst of it. We're not just looking through the clear glass of nous, nor are we assuming that there's something called a pure Cartesian consciousness. Um, so I'll note so we're going on with the liberalism theme, which involves Dugin and Zizek as the ones who had thought through these problems the furthest up until now. And so let me say, just in case, so we can't assume that, in a way, I'm assuming that the listeners are primarily people who have spent very long amounts of time thinking about these kind of subjects and are familiar with the basic ground. But we should say from the beginning what needs to be said here is, of course, there's a distinction between what's usually called classical liberalism, quote unquote, and what in America are called the liberals, quote unquote, meaning people like the far left of the Democratic Party, AOC, whoever you like, and then further there's something usually called the progressives, so like somebody like Roberto Unger or Cornel West or so. Sometimes Zizek himself is classed as a progressive in some vague way, though he describes himself as a leftist. But also he admits to being a bourgeois at times when he's confronted with accusations that he's not radical enough or so. So it's interesting that when we go into so what we're doing in a way is following Leo Strauss's footsteps, is we're going into the public square and we're saying, what's the talk all about here? And there's this word liberalism is being thrown around. And so, for instance, there's a good lecture on the Brian McGee series, which I recommend generally. There's a good lecture with Ronald Dworkin, the legal scholar, the how should I say it, law school professor, jurist, who tackles this modern problem of what he says flatly. It's a good statement there where he says what the issue is for me, for himself, is a war over he doesn't use the word war, but a war over the interpretation of this liberal tradition between Rawls and Nozick. Rawls on the left and Nozick on the right, and he tries to, as a more philosophic man, he tries to find the middle ground, the Mr. Bombadil position, as it were, away from the temptations of the rings on either side. So that's a good statement of the position of the war over the interpretation. I think that whole video. We have also the question of how did the thing get started. So like, we've been looking more around the pole around the American French Revolution, and you can point, and they themselves point back into certain, not the Americans, but the people that are theorizing on it, like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. You get quite a spectrum of different ideas on what the starting point here is with the social contract. And the basic issue, which is, I think we're obstructed from seeing it in the ordinary conversation, in the university conversation, precisely because it's what's usually said is, here we have this quote unquote legal fiction of the social contract. But what was for Hobbes and his the ones that followed after him, what they were concerned with is a doctrine of human action. So human action is what falls entirely under the sphere of the law. So, like, in other words, you're outside of the sphere of human action and considered like an object if you're uh, considered incapable of thinking for yourself, if you're considered incapacitated in some way or um, mentally deficient in some way, right? So how are we supposed to approach as people, as lawmakers or as the sovereign, the sphere of human action? How are we to judge it? And Hobbes begins with this metaphysical theory, remembering that Hobbes was, however it may look, Hobbes was still a metaphysician. And I point you to the Hobbes-Boyle dispute over whether there's a metaphysical vacuum or whether we have to understand the vacuum only from the secular point of view, which would mean only from external observation understood according to a certain idea of what observation or perception is. And that's worked out in people like Hume, but it was already had a rough meaning in the Royal Society, which Boyle, being a chemist, was a representative of. So Hobbes says here, the issue is it's not that he's making a historical statement. So you can understand that he, living in the time of Cromwell and so on, he thinks of the breakdown of society and then how do human beings act when society withdraws and you're just left without the policing power and so on. How do people act? There's that. So that is empirical. But what he's really talking about is we should regard human beings from the point of view of atomic individuals who, in their actions, when we judge them in their actions, we should treat them as basically as having what the Bill of Rights allows. That's the concrete, what's concretely demanded by the idea of the individual in Hobbes's way is that there be something like the Bill of Rights that defends people in their persons and so on. Unlike in a previous societies where the sovereign could take the side of the whole people. And for instance, it may be much better if you have, it's known in the community that there's a murder or so. If you always find a man and say, this is the guy that did it, so there's a general public opinion that murder is always being dealt with by the policing authority. Even if that's not true, it can still have a salutary effect on reducing crime for the whole country, right? And so the same thing in the negotiation between something like the Miranda rights or something like that. If the police have greater power vis-a-vis the individual, and there's a spectrum, there's a tension there between how much power to give the police and how much power they don't have, you get more on the side of treating the individual action as an action of an autonomous and even you could say a sovereign individual who is joined, who is to be regarded in his actions as sort of a member of the club, which is the nation, and to be treated accordingly. He's not a child who's under the sovereign as a father, but there's in other words, the idea is not that Hobbes is saying the state of nature is he's trying to describe something empirically, but rather he's trying to go into the essence of man and say this is how man ought to be regarded when we're making laws and thinking about legal issues. So this is the problem which Dugin has honed in on, the problem of the metaphysical individual and how it corresponds to liberalism in its modern rise. You see this question at a different level where it's basically assumed that there are the individual comes first and the society comes second. In the Hobbesian idea, the brute concrete notion is that anyone can, even the weak can kill the strong in the state of nature because they could wait till the strong are sleeping and kill them or poison them or other things. So in this brute way, everyone is equal, and that's a proof of the pre-society equality of human beings. But then you get n number of variations on this theme and how it's to be understood, and the more you look into it, problems come out. And so then by the time you get to when you look at it through Rousseau's lens, you get this complex issue where Rousseau kind of assumes there's he says everyone else has made these sort of bunk analyses where they're not really they're looking at man in the state of community, in the state of society, and then saying this is the state of nature when it's breakdown, but they're not looking at the real thing. But of course, Rousseau is way prior to any theory of evolution, so he looks at a little bit prior. Let's say he's on the cusp, just as Herder was, and he says, look at these baboons in the forest. They're some species of baboons he regards as man with basically physical man without society, and so he gets this different idea about it. What he leaves out, I think, is that if you think about evolution in terms of what he couldn't have thought is that if you think about evolution in terms of a reaction norm, our actual physical traits will be adjusting according to our environment, which includes society, and therefore, if we live in society for hundreds of years, that will radically change us. And there was also, that's very questionable that you could say there was one start. You can't really say there's one starting point because it's all unfolding in time, and there's different trees of the evolution and different, and also the whole. Once you add the losing guitar, he said the sideways rhizomic rather than tree form of evolution, then you get all kinds of problems, of course. So we're dealing partially with theories that are on grounds that don't impress us as cogent anymore in some ways. And then you have, so there's all kinds of issues like this. So then one can see that the question of what liberalism is comes into the light of in 1848. In the 1848 revolutions, you have another moment where you can really distinguish it in a way that's similar to Dugin's distinguishing it from the 20th century between fascism and communism. On the communism is like extreme left-wing liberalism, where you assume, following Rousseau's theory, that there has to be something like a general will, and therefore that the free individuals have to choose to alienate themselves from their freedom in order to adjust to the whole. So it's not, it's like a three-stage, like you have primitive, pre-liberal communism, which is more like the king is the father and then the people are under him. And then you have the liberal position of the individual, but then you have a third stage, which is like a synthetic stage where by our own autonomous will, we decide in this Kantian fashion to come back into a community, but through alienating ourselves from some of our natural freedoms because we think it's more rational. And then there's different questions on whether it's a question of utility and how utility is to be understood, or whether it's a question of the good or a telos of some kind, which is desirable in its own right. So in the 1848 revolutions, you have this split also where there's a conservative position, which is still a liberal position. So remember that Edmund Burke we can regard him as a conservative liberal. Within the liberal tradition, he's a conservative who's saying you can't have all this rationalistic quote unquote stuff that the French have. That doesn't really work, because what really happens is you have to churn things out over hundreds of years of deliberation of interested parties, but then he still believes in a kind of summa ratio, whereas we're building up. For instance, in a law through the presidents, it used to be believed that the presidents are building up, where eventually they'll get to the truth of the matter, to the eternal truth. Say in the case of the cruel and unusual punishment clause in the Constitution, originally whips the lash, as Scalia put it. Scalia raised this issue actually during his confirmation to the Supreme Court justices, that he said some of these clauses in the provisions in the Constitution have a certain evolutionary content, much against what's usually said about his originalism. He did raise that issue. I think we're running out of time. So again, this is a very long and complex issue, but we can see how this is being raised here, liberalism, in the way Plato was raising issues which are alive in his time, including the issue of how to improve society, which goes under the name agathon, or the good.